welcome to the Bardic Tales of Dahlia. I'm Austin, joined by my friend Sarah.
Hi, I'm Sarah, one of Austin's long-standing players.
Yes, long-standing for sure. What has it been? Almost 9 years now? It's a little too much. Yeah.
It's okay.
It's fine.
It's fine.
It's not okay. Please send help. Anyway. Last episode, which I assume will be last week, it just depends on how long it takes me to edit this episode. We talked about collaborative storytelling as well as kind of introducing ourselves and the world of Dahlia, effectively just a D&D plane that I had made up forever ago, and then ran a couple of campaigns through, and now we're just on to a really big, I guess, like, it's not really like an era of time, I should say, because it's taking place over, like, the course of a year, but it is changing the world quite a bit, so it's like a... Is Nexus event... Can we say that yet? Is that a spoiler too much? No one's going to get it.
not if we don't... No one's... They're okay, come on, some people are going to get it.
Some people are going to get it, but people that don't get it are going to care, so it's not really a thing.
It's fine.
Anyway... yeah, I mean, this is right now, this campaign, at least that we're in, which is campaign 2, is of 3. It's going to be a trilogy, but campaign 2 is setting up a lot of really big changes in the world. We have a lot of important people, growing through the ranks and becoming who they are. A lot of important people dying, which is a big deal, including some gods. So, that's a lot. And outside of that, we have players that are really changing the course of current history to kind of lead up to the final part of the trilogy. So that'll be a lot of fun. But today we wanted to, because we'd kind of introduced Dahlia a little bit last week, but I think what we want to do is maybe go over a little bit more specifics, but we're going to go into the more specifics of the main continent on Dahlia. Which is known as Germalo, if you remember from the last episode. And trying to go into a little bit more depth and then go over kind of introducing the party from the first campaign, because we're going to go over all the lore kind of leading up to campaign 2, and then eventually do the lore from campaign 2 leading into campaign 3. So, which
will be certainly a ride. I have way too much to say about this campaign, so.
There's a lot. I mean, oh, jeez. We want to talk about not only storytelling and just big pieces of history, but just like traumatic pieces of history, where there has been a lot of stuff that has really kind of created a weird environment as far as stuff like that goes. So
yeah, for sure. So
yeah. So I guess we're gonna. Or do you have something to say?
No. This is so with Dahlia, and this was mentioned last episode, and Austin, I'm sure, will go more into this. Dahlia as a whole didn't have a name until the second campaign, so it's been kind of nice as we've progressed, being able to have sort of this united realm, and something actually. With the maps and with all that, something we're seeing. So I'm actually kind of really excited to get the chance to go over that and share this world that's been built. So I guess we'll start there.
Yeah, I mean, like, I think we mentioned it last week where we talked about the 4 main continents. The original one being Germalo, which is the one that I had people start in, and then I had... multiple campaigns. I even had a couple campaigns kind of setting up before that, ones that I had like in high school before I even met you, and a couple of parties that kind of ran through different sections and parts of that continent. That was always my world. And then eventually when it came to this campaign, I was like, well, why don't we make it bigger, because I want to expand on it and I want to add things. And I eventually added the 3 other continents, Aedanys, Bella, and Pike. And now, I mean, we don't even have like a whole lot of lore. You guys have what? You guys have gone to Bella in character, and that's pretty much it. I mean...
Well, yeah, I mean, we went to Bella as a group for like a whole minute.
Yeah.
And otherwise, we had a previous character who hailed from Aedanys and spent time in Pike. But on the by and large, no, we haven't really explored much outside
Hmm.
of Germalo, which is saying something because we're what are we now, level 14? So, um, it's a huge world,
Yeah, I
honestly.
mean, it's definitely like obviously a world when you talk about. I mean, you talk about like Earth, right? Just as an example, like Earth is gigantic. Someone can live their entire lives in a single country, even if that country is small, right? Um, and still not see every corner of it. And it's no different than you kind of get into this, and this place is huge. I mean, 4 continents, even though they might not look like much, and a lot of the world is covered in water, there's still a big chunk of the actual like world itself that has been kind of unexplored.
Right.
Um, which we even learned in like this most previous session that we had, that there's
Yeah.
some places outside of this. Um, one
Well,
thing
it's
that no, go ahead.
I was gonna say it's also just fair to note that unlike certain other campaign settings, Dahlia is flat,
Yeah, I was
which is
actually just gonna mention that. Yeah.
yeah. So that's
Um,
particularly fun because we have no idea what the edges of the Earth actually look like. That's not something, to my knowledge, that anybody has explored or knows about. As far as we know, at the very least, or as far as is public knowledge, or world knowledge.
Public
Um,
world player knowledge as of right now, I will say no one knows. I
yeah,
know, but no one else knows.
I would hope you would
and
know.
and there's some spoilers in that I'm not gonna reveal because obviously we haven't gotten there in character.
Well, now I'm
But
excited.
yeah, it's fun. Um, but by and large, this episode at least we wanted to kind of just jump into Germalo itself and kind of explore some of the region and the continent. So it Germalo being, I mean, it's still very large. I think the actual, because like I used to have a map. I can't find it anymore, but the map had a like distance measurement scale on it effectively that kind of said like, okay, this is how long it takes from get to point A to point B kind of thing. Um, and if I recall correctly, if you went like left side to right side all the way over, it's probably a few days travel. No, it's more than that
Yeah,
because
I mean, because
it's like a week from the Glass Keep to Summercrest.
yeah, and that's not accounting for
Travel on the
natural.
ground. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So
I
I
mean
mean,
they
as the
are
crow
currently
flies.
traveling. As the crow flies, it's a week from the Glass Keep to Summercrest, which isn't even all the way north to south along the in fact continent itself. I would say it's definitely a few weeks travel across through the air versus not even counting the ground. Um, but Germalo itself is broken up into 4 main locations or regions. I think we called them realms, is what we ended up naming them. I cannot remember.
Well, because I mean,
Um,
it's officially we ended up titling it the United Realms of Germalo. So we
yeah.
spent a while trying to decide what did we want to call this, because there are these 4 main realms or locations. I mean, they're essentially like provinces.
Yeah, province
Um,
is a really good way to put that, I think.
yeah.
It's
So
they've always been kind of broken up that way.
yeah, and I mean, it doesn't seem like there's never been any real clear defining um like territorial boundaries. It's not like, okay, this country is here and this country is there and they are separate governments. It's more, a lot of it seems based off of natural land structures. So, for example, the dunes of Dev are so named and is its separate thing because it's a giant desert. So that kind of separates it from the other uh, regions or provinces. I guess provinces more implies governmental boundaries,
Mm-hmm.
but the other four regions, so they're very much divided by natural landmarks and like landscapes as opposed to clearly defined boundary borders. You cross the border from Mexico to the United States, or the United States to Canada, or even within provinces or states within individual countries. That's not so here. There isn't. It's not quite as clear cut from what I can tell.
Not really. I mean, so the main divide is that Germalo, in the very center of the continent, has a basically like a star-shaped, not star, it's not 5-pointed, a 4-pointed star-shaped set of mountains that kind of separate each of the regions. In the very, very center, there's the sort of the larger mountains, but these mountains kind of extend across each of these borders to help separate each of the areas. To kind of break down each area just really quickly, the first one you're looking at is Germalo, which is the actual continent, but also the region. Germalo is the southwestern side of everything. That's where the Glass Keep exists. That's also where a lot of the main story at least took place. Like the first act was a lot of Germalo. I mean, you guys still do quite a bit of it now too, but it definitely takes place a lot more here. North of that is Pelora. Now, Pelora is the best way to think of it is less like the Shire, although it's got a very similar Shire feel. But things like, if you're familiar with Magic: The Gathering, then Lorwyn is very similar, where there's these like long, extended fields of crops, lots of farmland, very happy-go-lucky things, and this is where the halflings and gnomes exist, basically. That's kind of their region. But it's very, not necessarily happy-go-lucky, but very, easygoing, maybe, is probably the word to look at. I don't know.
I always kind of imagined it, and I mean, this is a little bit Shire-esque, at least in the kind of vibe that it gives off. Whereas Germalo itself is very wrapped up in a lot of political things going on. It's much more active, much more involved in, okay, the world is falling apart or something is happening. Mm-hmm. You head up into Pelora, and it's a little bit separated from those bigger events in the world. It's kind of its own thing. It's not to say that it doesn't see side effects. We know for a fact that's not true, but it's a little more withdrawn. It's a little less worried about the bigger picture, or at least that's the feeling I got when we went to Summercrest and when we moved through it. It's just like happy-go-lucky, I guess, is the best way to put it. It's a little bit calmer and more. It's
tucked away from the problems of the world. Yes. Effectively.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. Or at least it's trying to be as tucked away from the problems of the world. But yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
The moving to the east of Pelora is the Dunes of Dev, which you've already kind of explained, is this just sort of vast desert. There isn't a whole lot of it that seems quote-unquote explored. There hasn't been a lot of people that have kind of scoured it looking for anything because they're unsure of, survival being something that they can actually handle in there. There really isn't much to say about this. I mean, the one or two times you guys went to the dunes were short and sweet, effectively.
Well, and one of them we starved and dehydrated nearly to death. So,
okay, that one. But like, you guys were doing that on purpose.
I understand. I'm just saying it. It's a harsh place.
That's true. It is very harsh.
It's it's a big desert. I don't know. Like, what else?
And then, last but not least, is the Forest of Alva. This is basically just a large forest to the south of the desert. It is the location of effectively most elves. There's sort of two collections of elves. There's those who live in the Forest of Alva, and then there are the elves that live elsewhere, who are generally seen not necessarily as outcasts from elves themselves, but the elves in the main city, known as Hanal Gilan, they almost look down on elves that have left the protection of that city. And this is sort of the main location for them. In this region is also a small collection of islands known as the Floating Isles. They are islands that have been there for a very long time. People are not really sure why they exist. They just happen to be these islands that are kind of floating off the coast. They're not necessarily arranged in any way, but they also aren't very explored. So they're always kind of looking at them with different lights than a lot of other places. They seem sort of mystical in their own sense.
I mean, I think
that's kind of the breakdown of the location. Yeah, I mean, there really isn't a lot to talk about for each of these regions. I kind of went over. We kind of covered the basis for each one of them.
Yeah, I mean, Germalo is where most of the action, as it were, has largely taken place. So breaking down that is kind of its own task. Mm-hmm. But I mean, the world is vast and complicated. And a world designed like this, specifically as Germalo, it's got very classic Fantasyland feel, mm-hmm. where, it's very classic elves in the forest and dwarves in the mountains and everybody else kind of in the plains, near a river that exports things. But I think there's a reason that works, and there's a reason that trope keeps popping up, is because, it works to set a story off. So we've had, you start us in somewhere like Dunes of Dev, we're never going to get anywhere, but sticking us in the middle of Germalo, where we've got, access to just about every major culture and anything we could really need is, that's where your action really needs to start, unless you're running something very, very specific. Mm-hmm. The model works, I guess is what I'm saying.
Yeah, that's definitely true. I mean, there's obviously a lot of differences. I think that's an entire episode of itself to talk about the different cultures that exist in the world. I mean, the elves that you see are not traditional elves the way that you would probably imagine them. While they are good, hunters and gatherers and things, and of those of the woods, they've got a few differences that kind of make them stand out. And the same is with the dwarves, where they aren't your typical, must mine all the time, fight with battle axe kind of style, dwarves. They're also very different. And it was I don't know about necessarily like a point of contention or anything of that nature, but I know that there was... It was, I think, different for people to kind of get used to that coming into this campaign very specifically, but also the last one.
Yeah, and I mean, one of the things that... so it's always been an issue in I shouldn't say an issue, a criticism of Dungeons and Dragons up to this point, of these very stereotyped cultures and races and very Tolkien-esque. Mm-hmm. And, this world, at the very least, has worked in a lot of ways to try to subvert that, which, again, entirely different episode on the cultures of the world. But I mean, yeah, it's different. And it's, there's things worth keeping when it comes to the traditional Fantasyland, which, like arrangement, like put yourselves near a river or a trade town, something like that. But then there's also things that maybe need retooling a little bit, such as, and this has been popular as of recently, not all drow and orcs are evil, for example, and not having quite as much emphasis on, if you are this race of people, you act like this, and this is what your culture is like. Mm-hmm. And Germalo, the United Realms of Germalo has definitely subverted that in some ways, but again,
and the things, I mean, the things that I've taken, like, there are some inherent pieces of cultures that like exist that are still the same. But as far as this world is concerned, as far as Dahlia and the quote unquote like planes of existence around it and everything, everything is kind of flipped on its head. It just in like a basic list, like elves are not the same mystical hunter-gatherer do magic stuff, right? They do that, but they have a lot of other quirks. The dwarves are not miners. The orcs are not raiders and pillagers. The gnomes and halflings are considered the same race to a lot of people because people don't recognize the difference. The gods in this world are not... They're just people. They're not, they're not like these. I mean, they are very powerful beings, but they aren't like, they have real emotions and real story, and there's depth to them. And that was like a big thing when I went into this campaign, and when I write my stories, is I don't like the idea that all drow must be evil, or all dwarves must be battle axe wielding miners, or all orcs must be these big brute of men and women that must like fight eternally. Like, I don't like tropes like that, and so I changed it a lot going into this.
Yeah, no, and it's worked. It's worked well. So.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that I think talking about all those differences. I mean, that's a whole episode, probably even two in and of itself.
For sure.
But what I was kind of getting towards and moving towards is that we wanted to introduce the old cast members, basically the first party, and kind of talk about that a little bit, and how a lot of them were probably not necessarily different, but like a lot of them, I think, had similar thought styles. I mean, I know in campaign 1, people probably thought of the same tropes for those races, and that became a thing.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, realistically looking at it, we are talking something that started 8 years ago, and we started the campaign in 4th edition, if I remember correctly.
That is true.
And how with the kind of advent of 5th edition, and as it has continued built and become, I believe, the most popular Dungeons and Dragons edition up to this point, there has been a much greater emphasis on, breaking away from tropes. We see it with how I believe Wizards of the Coast is changing the word race to origin now. And it's so I mean, when talking about the old party, I guess what I'm trying to get at is where people may have fallen into tropes then might not have, different campaigns, different flavors, and a whole bunch of people in between. So
you want to talk about this is a great segue. It is possible to have too many players. It is possible to have players that don't work. I think everyone that wants to play D&D, I know that there's a home for them. I'm a firm believer in that. The problem is that not every player is going to fit at every table.
Yeah.
And we've seen that 1,000 times over. So.
We've seen it quite a bit. So kind of pointing towards another content creator, Matt Colville has a really great episode in his Running the Game series that I am going to 100% plug for him a little bit, that talks about, because it has been absolutely phenomenal in my understanding of what I want as a player, what I would want as a DM, and how I interact with the members of my party. And it's an entire episode that talks about different, and I can't find the episode, or I can't think of the episode off the top of my head, but talks about how everybody wants something different from the game. There are players who just want to be really cool in combat. There are players who don't care so much about combat and would rather, have this really flavorful story. There's characters that just want to go murder hobo. There's characters that just want to break the game. And I say characters, I should be saying players. And, there's players that just kind of want to sit back and have a good time and hang out with their friends and, exist alongside the story. And all of those people do not fit in the same party, no matter what anybody tries to tell you. And they don't all align with every DM. So, unfortunately, this is something that our group has had a lot of trial and error with, and I think every group struggles with to some degree.
Mm-hmm.
There's a really great saying that says someone can be your best friend, but not every friend is someone you can play D&D with. And that has proven true countless times. More times than I care to admit.
Yeah, I mean, so when we talk about, like, the first campaign, you and I have sat down and to ad nauseum talked about the number of people we've had in the campaign. And I think we sat there at, like, 2 a.m. at Perkins talking about and listing off every single person in the party, like, that was in the party, every single player. And I think we ended up still missing somebody.
We did. We figured that out like 2 weeks ago. We figured it out,
and we're sorry to that person because you were lovely. But it was just we had gone through the list of just so many people that we had played with, and it took a long time. I mean, it took we played the first campaign for like 5 years, roughly.
Yeah.
And we eventually kicked in, like, we had a break in between where we eventually then started this campaign, and we did a lot of curating, I think, to, like, get this party to where it is. And, like, not to say that we, like, picked and chose the people that were, like, we didn't, like, there were people that left the group, but there weren't, like, people that, like, joined and then we were like, you're just not meshing, boom, you're gone. It was, like, a different style where, like, once we found the beginning of this campaign where we were, as a party, we were really cohesive, anyone that wasn't fitting stopped fitting. Like, that's just what it came down to.
So, looking back into campaign 1, I will say when we sat down and listed off everybody that played in those, I think it was like 4 or 5 years, the number ranked well over a dozen people that moved in and out of the table.
There were 11 players at one point.
Yeah, somehow you got stuck with me and I'm still here. But,
well, I had this philosophy back then, which I think this is a good point to make for anyone who is planning on DMing or is looking for any sort of DM advice. One thing I can give is that if you're losing a player, which we used to live in a college town, so that happened all the time, right? Where we would get a player for like 2 years or a year and a half or whatever, and then they'd graduate and they'd have to move, right? So we would lose them as a player. And that happened all the time. We lost, I don't know, 5 to 6 players, I think, through that. And like, during that time where I was like, okay, well, I want to get somebody, I want to replace this person, not like that I can replace that person, but like, I want to fix the fact that there's going to be a spot open, right? Because if the party is losing, quote, like their rogue, right? Who are they going to have to pick locks, right? So like, I was like, okay, well, let's fix that. Let's find a new party member who can take that place, kind of keep the story going, blah, blah, blah. And we would sit down and I'd be like, okay, well, I need someone to fit this slot, but I don't know who's going to mesh well. Okay, here's 4 people. Let's run them a couple of weeks, see if they kind of fit the party, and then we'll figure out which one is going to work the best, like based on scheduling or based on whatever. And the problem with a shotgun mentality like that, where you're trying to get, one name to stick through 4 names, when all 4 names happen to be totally fine and they don't mesh like perfectly, but they mesh okay, you're stuck with 4 extra people. And like that happened a lot in the first campaign.
Yeah, and it really, it bogs down combat, and it makes it very hard to build meaningful character interactions because there's just too many people. So, solid advice. Pick a number and stick with it, and don't overfill.
I think that I would find it hard to run a game with only 3 people, but I think it's probably fine for 3 people. I think 1 and 2 players also fine if that's your thing. I could not do it because I don't think that it would. I don't like the cohesion. I like there being multiple people. I'm an extrovert. I like being around a lot of people.
Yeah,
But,
there's something to be said for one-on-ones. I run one with my partner on occasion, and it's a lot of fun, but it's a very different experience.
it's completely different experience.
Most people want the experience of running with a party, and it really seems like the kind of magic number there is somewhere between 4 to 6, and that's, I think, what everybody would expect. Is that's what the game's built for, and they got it right.
Actually, you had mentioned like having a big party like that bogs down combat. That is something. There's like a mathematical thing there to like look at where like the number of players you have after like 4 and 5, things start to get exponentially bogged down, right?
Yeah.
Like a 1-person combat that could take no time at all. 2 to 3 people, a little bit longer, obviously, but it starts getting worse and worse the more and more you go. And that definitely becomes true if there's any sort of distractions. Like I think I could sit down at a table with a party of 5 people and just like on a normal day, like our group, right? Run them through a combat and not have anything super crazy happen or anything, but like the combat just runs and it would last, I don't know, let's say an hour, just like a round number. But like if I took the same people and added a 6th person, but then I made sure that everybody was always on top of what, the turn order was when the turn came up, they were not distracted at all. They still had to do all their stuff, blah, blah, blah. I think it would still take the same amount of time. It's because like, there's such a difference between 5 and 6, and then like 6 and 7 is drastic, and then 7 to 8 is way worse. Like it just gets so bogged down so quickly. So I think keeping it in that healthy window is correct.
And the term herding cats comes to mind, where it's just trying to keep that many people focused. There's people who have a hard enough time keeping focused when there's only 3 other people who have combat, let alone, when you've got 6 other people. So it's a lot of work on the DM too. Like, no joke.
They have to keep track of not only the monsters, everything, but the fact is they have to think about like what the monster wants to do in that situation, or monsters, I should say. And when there's more people to consider, there's more things kind of on top of that.
It certainly makes balancing combat a task. So, kind of going from that, so we had all of these players that moved in and out, and my understanding is when it came time to start the second campaign, based on a number of factors, you ended up choosing a canon party. Campaign 1 was long and involved and changed quite a bit because we jumped from 4th edition to D&D Next to 5th edition to Pathfinder, and it was a little bit all over the place. So we ended up picking, or you ended up picking, I should say, a number of characters that said, okay, these are the people we are saying were the heroes, quote unquote, of campaign 1 on the by and large.
Yes, those were sort of like... there were 8 members, and those 8 members were basically, these are the people that not necessarily mattered the most as far as characters go. Like, that's not the way I want to put this, but they were the quote unquote heroes. The other people existed, but were kind of, as far as the story is concerned, just going to be something like, I don't want to say like side characters either, because that's not right, but the focus of the story is going to be on these 8 people.
And realistically, when we're talking about a campaign that built and lived the way that this one did, when you're talking about a trilogy, you have to pick that. So it's not a slight against those that weren't, quote unquote, chosen. It kind of came down somewhat to, okay, well, what was your character doing and what were they involved in this greater plot?
Or how much were they involved in?
Right. Yeah. So... it certainly isn't a slight, because I wouldn't be surprised if some of those people end up listening to this podcast. Wasn't a slight against anybody. It just was kind of, you had to narrow it at some point. So
absolutely, yeah. I mean, it definitely. I think the majority of people that we like played with in the first campaign, I was very happy playing with them. Absolutely. There were definitely some bad apples, but most of them were great. So
yeah. So with that, let's introduce the was it 8?
There's 8, yeah, and I've got the
yes.
list in front of me, so I can just kind of read them off, and then what I think I'm going to do is I'm going to read them off, kind of tell a little bit about them, and I'm just going to have you kind of explain a little bit about the characters from your memory. Can you do that?
Sure.
All right.
Yeah.
So let's start with this character. Very, very undertoned, not that important at all. Her name is Tajari. She's...
All right, so did you have other things you wanted to talk about during this episode? Because I just need to... Okay, so Taj is my... Tajari Demorn, a.k.a. Taj. She's my character. She is a tiefling sorcerer. She started out in 4th edition as a tiefling avenger, and she was an avenger of Asmodeus. And over the years and over the course of the story, I'd always kind of had her pegged for some sort of redemption arc. And that built and morphed and changed. And with quite a bit of tinkering, she is still the character that I am playing now in Campaign 2. It's a very long story that
there's a long story. I think there's going to be an entire episode just called Tajari,
okay.
where it's just like start to finish her story, because they're like, wow, there's so much, right?
So
like you were the only person who's been playing, other than myself, obviously. You're the only person who's been playing for what, like the entire 9 years.
The entire 9 years. So she was one of the first characters. I won't say the first D&D character I built. She was like the second or third, because this was one of the second or third campaigns I had ever played in. And my personal goal with her was, like I said, there was this idea of a redemption arc, but I just wanted to build someone who was cool and did neat stuff. And so she started out as this Avenger, and then we ended up hybrid classing her into Avenger Warlock, because it was 4th edition and you could do that. And 8 years later, she is now a pyromancer sorcerer. So I light things on fire because I'm a tiefling.
How original.
How original, right? So
next up,
so that's Taj.
Taj, and oh my God, Taj is wonderful. There's a lot to talk about.
I'm not projecting at all. Okay, different episode.
All right, let's calm down. Next up is Gwelwith. How much do you remember about Gwelwith? I mean, obviously she was played by a friend of ours named Taylor, who is wonderful, and the character was originally a bard, I believe.
Yes, she was a bard, because remember, Taylor used to bring her saxophone
and play
and actually
at the table.
Play.
Yeah, that was awesome.
Yeah, it was great. So, so I don't, it's been so long, I don't remember a lot about the intricacies, but I do know my character and Gwelwith had a very good relationship. Gwelwith was very lighthearted, happy-go-lucky, and I mean, she was a bard. She was great. She was really good at being a bard. So,
yeah, that's basic. I mean, most of these characters have connections over to, this campaign.
Yes.
There's a lot of like things to talk about there, I think, but that was like a big point in the storytelling, was having all these connections to this old campaign. So
yes.
Next up was Sehaven.
Yeah, that was Cassie's character, correct?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I don't remember a lot about her. I do remember there were some switches. She was royalty.
She was elven royalty.
Yes.
And I think there was, I don't remember exactly how we did it. We first originally, like, this is quote unquote like not necessarily a canon part of the story, but originally she was a Githzerai.
Yes.
But we ended up changing that because when we went to D&D Next, they didn't have a Githzerai. And so we had made a lot of like inside jokes about her just hiding her true identity or whatever.
And she was actually an elf.
She was actually an elf, yeah. She is elvish
elf.
royalty. Yeah.
Yeah.
And then so I mean, she currently has not had any connection to this campaign, but that isn't to say that it won't happen.
Right.
Next up is Freya.
Yeah, so Freya was run by our good friend Jess, who is actually playing with us again now as a different character in campaign 2. She was a paladin of Paylor, wasn't she?
Yes.
Yeah, and that was, if I remember correctly, I believe that was Jess's first time playing D&D.
Yeah, to my recollection, she had never played D&D before that campaign.
Yeah. So and Freya was just everything you'd expect in a paladin, very light and good and Paylor.
Had no idea why she was with the party.
Why am I here?
All right. Next up is a fun one, Edriel.
Oh yeah, that was Mia's character.
It was.
That was Mia. So Edriel was she an elf?
Yes, she was I think she was a high elf or a Eladrin, one of the two.
Yeah,
she might have been an Eladrin.
She might have been, but she was a druid. Yes, yeah. So she was a druid. She had an owl familiar. Yeah. She saved my hide and stopped me from getting dead. Well, I did get dead. She brought me back.
She has recently had a connection to this campaign.
She did. She actually showed up, which I think was a great callback. Turned out she was a vampire.
Spoilers though.
Anyway, but yeah, so Edriel was there. She came in a little bit later. And I'm going to be honest, I don't remember too much about her overarching story or her backstory.
To my knowledge, she was just a druid of the land that kind of traveled by herself, looking for a purpose, and then found it with the party, to my knowledge.
That sounds about right.
But I cannot remember exactly. Again, this has been years, so...
Yeah. It's been quite a while, so...
So we've got Ook.
I am Ook now. Ook was Ook was played by Sean.
Yeah.
He was an orc barbarian who was named Ook because he found an axe, and on the axe it said "property of Ook," and he picked it up and went, "Oh, I guess I'm Ook now." So if he had a name before that, we don't know it. One
of my favorite character, just like, it's like a small little detail that people put into their characters that it's like not like a catchphrase necessarily, but just my favorite one of all time is his, where he's just very calmly puts a finger up and says, I'm gonna rage. And I love that. It's just like a really calm, I'm gonna go into a bloody rage right now.
He was the calmest barbarian I have ever met.
It was great.
He was the calmest orc barbarian.
Lovely.
He was great.
Lovely person.
Ook was great.
Devious.
Okay. So, Devious has made multiple appearances in Campaign 2. He was also an Avenger. He was an Avenger... what did they call them? Not Celestials. Asimars.
Yeah, he's an Asimar Avenger.
And he was an Avenger of one of the members of the Dark Six. I believe it was the Shadow.
Correct.
In particular. And he and Taj ended up actually developing a relationship at the table. And it was very wholesome. It was very, tiefling and Asimar and tiefling. There was a lot of pretty funny moments with that.
Yeah,
admittedly, we were children. We were, but we were definitely, the typical relationships at the table. But it was fine. It worked out great. So yeah, that was played by Andy. Devious has had quite a role in this campaign, where he had a lot of connections with Taj during some backstory that will maybe eventually get covered. And as was mentioned in the first episode, he recently died, and it was very sad. And I cried, and I'm still not really over it. So.
Yeah, I was going to say had is a cue. Anyway.
Yeah. So
Andy, if you're listening to this, we love you, man.
I'm
And
still upset.
yeah. And last but not least is Khalees.
Oh yeah, well, we're missing the current BBEG. So
Yeah.
Khalees was a character who was played actually by my partner Nathan, and he was he officially an arcane trickster?
Yes.
Was that So he was an arcane trickster who, I don't remember the full breadth of his original backstory, but ended up being revealed to be the son of the bad guy in Campaign 1, who is called the Fisher King. And Khalees was revealed to be his son.
Just a quick little input here. Next week's episode is all about the Fisher King, and all about his sort of story. So it's going to go a lot in depth there. But yeah, Khalees was revealed to be the son of the Fisher King, and it eventually led into Campaign 2, where he is now the BBEG.
Yeah. And I guess now thinking about it, his kind of original story was underground rogues, thieves guild sort of thing. That's where he grew up, and it kind of evolved from there. But yeah, so Khalees is now the bad guy in Campaign 2. And that has certainly been interesting, interacting with an old party member while my partner who played Khalees is sitting at the table and I'm sitting here. It's been great. So
it has definitely been interesting, to say the least.
For sure.
And yeah, I mean, there's one thing that I've never really enjoyed as a like watching other people do like DMing and stuff, where I've never been a big fan of the DM is going to throw a twist on everything at like the last minute kind of thing. But that is one twist that I've thoroughly enjoyed, where just like sitting down when we were talking about Session 0, and I was like, yeah, the bad guy is your old party member.
Yeah.
And it was definitely an interesting ride. So
yeah, for sure. So, but that's so that's the canon party, picked from a number of others who, like I said, were absolutely great. I have a lot of memories with other people that weren't listed, but that was who it ended up being kind of narrowed down to. So
yeah, those are kind of the heroes that we wanted to showcase as being the ones who ran through the events of the first campaign. That kind of lead into the second one, because the first campaign has a lot of honestly, it ran for far too long for obvious reasons, and that's a whole point by itself too, but it ran for a very long time, and a lot of the stuff that happened in it is now being called back to from Campaign 2, but a big point is that it was not as much of a setup as Campaign 2 is. Like, Campaign 1 should have set up for Campaign 2, and then Campaign 2 should have set up for Campaign 3, but unfortunately it didn't do a lot of that. So
yeah,
but there's a big story there that we still want to go over and cover, and kind of lead into the known canon for talking about Campaign 2. So
and that is slated for next week, is getting into the Campaign 1 storyline. So that should be fun.
That is very, very fun. I'm excited for that.
Oh yeah, for sure. So
he is a great villain, and I had a lot of fun writing him.
Yeah. He's a villain I hate.
Yeah,
I have a lot of words about the Fisher King.
There he is. All right. I think we have definitely talked a little bit longer than we wanted to, but we kind of got everything over and went all the way through it. So do you have any last comments you want to make before we call it for the week?
No, I think that pretty much covers it. I want to kind of reemphasize, like, there were a lot of players, and we talked about it briefly, but it's okay if your friends don't fit at your table. Frankly speaking, the only other piece of advice I really have is, when someone isn't fitting, don't drag it out. Either solve the problem, or for everybody's sake, sort of make sure that everybody's having a good time.
Mhm.
Nothing, after having had so many people move in and out, I've had way too many experiences where it's been like, nobody wants to leave, nobody wants to get asked to leave, but make sure you've got a healthy group. Pick wisely as a DM, and don't overburden yourself either. Don't have a party of 11 people, Austin, where
Don't attack me.
where everybody just feels bogged down. But other than that, no, I don't have a lot. That pretty much covers it. So
Perfect. Well, yeah, I mean, I think that's probably all that we've got for this. And I think this is a good place to end it, and we'll be back hopefully next week. I kind of hope this is just a weekly thing. It really comes down to like how much time I get to edit, but hopefully we can get that coming out next week as well, and we will see you guys then.
yeah, see you next week.
Bye.
Bye.